Nest and Story, Chapter 1. The One Who Stayed. The rain had begun just after dusk, soft and steady, like the forest had exhaled and the sky followed suit. It didn't come in torrents or drama, but in a hush, a lullaby of droplets on pine needles, rooftop shingles, and the old stone path that wound through the trees. And down that path, someone walked. Her name was Elia. And whether the forest knew her name or not didn't seem to matter, because it welcomed her anyway. The wind, rushing low through the branches, leaned toward her like an old friend remembering a promise. She wasn't new to this place. Not exactly. The memory of it lived in her in scattered ways, a smell here, a warmth there, the feeling of a kettle beginning to hum. But it had been years since her feet had touched this soil. Years since she last saw the little cabin tucked between the hills. She stepped carefully, as if afraid the trail might vanish if she moved too quickly. The rain softened as she neared the clearing. The trees bowed just slightly, enough for her to see the familiar shape of the cabin, its pitched roof a silhouette against the night. A faint glow spilled from the windows, golden and kind. She paused. The air held a scent she had nearly forgotten, cedarwood, wet moss, and the memory of cinnamon. Elia exhaled. Then she stepped forward, her boots sinking gently into the softened earth. The stones of the porch shifted beneath her weight with a soft crunch. She ran her hand along the wooden railing, its grain worn smooth by time and weather. The door stood just as it had before, slightly crooked, with the same hand-forged handle cool beneath her fingers. She pushed it open. The hinges groaned a little. Not in protest, but in recognition. Warmth greeted her. Not just the warmth of fire or room, but the kind that lived in old quilts, in stories half finished, in mugs left clean and waiting. She stepped inside. The cabin was just as she remembered it, a fireplace to the left, armchair near the hearth, a narrow staircase curling upward like a secret. Shelves lined with jars of herbs, books whose spines leaned on each other like old companions, and in the far corner, a low table where letters had once been written under lamplight. She placed her coat on the peg by the door and removed her boots, setting them beside the doormat that still bore the outline of her last visit. The fire crackled softly. She didn't rush to do anything. She just stood there for a while, listening to the cabin breathe around her. The slow settling of timber, the pop of a coal, the distant rumble of thunder far beyond the hills. Then, with a quiet sigh, she crossed the room, picked up the kettle, and placed it on the stove. This night didn't ask questions. It only asked her to stay. Elia sat near the fire, her fingers wrapped around the warm mug she'd just poured. The tea inside was steeped from dried apple peel, chamomile, and a pinch of something she couldn't quite name but recognized from childhood. It tasted like calm. Outside, the rain deepened its rhythm, like a steady voice telling a story that never quite ended. She watched it through the window. Droplets weaving silver paths down the glass, streaking the outside world into a watercolor of pines and darkness. The chair beneath her creaked gently as she shifted, drawing the old woolen blanket across her lap. It still smelled faintly of lavender and sun-dried linen. With each sip, her thoughts slowed. The cabin had a way of doing that, of easing the world out of your chest, bit by bit, until you breathed differently. She noticed now what she hadn't seen in the rush of arrival. A cat curled on the edge of the hearth, its fur ink-black and tail flicking lazily with the firelight. It looked at her once, blinked slowly, then returned to its dreams. Elia smiled. "Still here, hmm?" The cat made no reply, but its presence was an answer all the same. She glanced at the small bookshelf beside the fireplace, its contents gently swaying with time. One book leaned out as if inviting her closer. She set the mug down and stood, running her fingers along the worn spines until she found it, a faded blue journal, soft at the edges, the leather binding cracked in quiet ways. Opening it, she found pages filled with handwritten notes, recipes, poems, dreams perhaps. Some in her handwriting, others in someone else's. She turned to a random page. When it rains long enough, the trees start to remember names. They whisper them between drops. She ran her thumb along the ink. It had bled slightly, as if written during a storm like tonight. The rain tapped harder now. Not angry, just more insistent, like a memory trying not to be forgotten. She read for a while, each page like a conversation with the past. The words didn't always make sense. But they didn't need to. Some stories weren't puzzles to solve. They were blankets to wrap around you. Eventually, her eyes grew heavy. She set the journal aside, blew gently on the lamp until its glow softened, and curled into the armchair. The fire dimmed just enough to cast shadows, and the cat stretched before climbing onto the blanket and settling beside her. The last thing she heard before sleep was the sound of rain against the cabin roof, and the feeling of being known. Sometime before dawn, Elia awoke not from noise, but from a sense that something had shifted. The fire had dwindled to a warm hush, coals resting like lazy stars behind the grate. The cat had relocated to the back of the chair, purring quietly in sleep. She stretched, careful not to jostle the blanket, and stood. The cabin felt different now, as if holding its breath. The rain had stopped. Or perhaps only paused. Her eyes drifted upward, following the curve of the staircase she'd once been so curious about. As a child, it had been off-limits, roped off with twine and her grandmother's firm voice. Not yet. One day. Tonight felt like that day. She stepped softly onto the first step. It gave a polite creak beneath her foot. Then the next. The wood was warm beneath her socks, like the stairs had been waiting. At the top was a small landing. Just ahead, a narrow wooden door, its surface slightly bowed, a single brass knob at its center. She turned it gently. The room beyond was lit by moonlight, seeping through a high arched window. Dust motes floated like memories in the silver air. It was an attic, but not the forgotten kind. The space was simple, purposeful. A low table with a map of the forest, marked with tiny hand-drawn icons. Shelves lined with boxes, each labeled with looping script, autumn leaves, pressed, letters to the wind, dreams left unfinished. At the far end, a trunk sat beneath the window. Elia walked to it, brushing dust from the lid. It opened with a sigh. Inside, she found bundles of cloth, old photographs, and a stack of journals tied together with ribbon. One stood out, covered in pale green fabric, its corners worn smooth. She untied it. The first page held only one sentence, "Write what waits." And below it, a blank space. She sat, the journal open in her lap, the window casting quiet light across the pages. Her fingers hesitated above the paper. Then, slowly, they began to move. She wrote not facts or history, but feeling, the rain, the cat, the way the cabin smelled like memory. The strange comfort of being alone, but never lonely. She wrote until her eyes blurred and her hands slowed. She closed the journal gently, slid it back into the trunk, and stood. Outside, the rain had returned. Just enough to remind her it was still there. She made her way back down the stairs, each step carrying a little more weight than before. Not from burden, but from meaning. The cat greeted her with a blink. The fire greeted her with a spark. She curled once more into the chair, and slept without dreaming. Morning came slowly, like a dream reluctant to end. The light filtering through the cabin windows was pale and soft, the kind that arrived on tiptoe so as not to disturb. Elia opened her eyes, not startled, but gently aware of the new day. The fire had gone out during the night, leaving behind a bed of faintly glowing coals. The cat was gone from her lap, but not far, curled instead by the door, one eye half open, tail twitching in slow rhythm. Elia sat up, rubbing her eyes. Her body ached pleasantly, the kind of ache that follows deep rest. She stood, stretched, and padded quietly into the small kitchen nook. The kettle was still on the stove. She filled it again, lit the flame, and moved about in silence, the way one moves in sacred places. There was no rush. There never was here. As the water heated, she wandered to the writing desk in the corner, the one with the brass-handled drawers and oil lamp resting gently atop it. Something called her there, though she couldn't say what. She pulled out the chair and sat. The cushion let out a soft sigh beneath her. The desk held only a few items, a jar of dried violets, a smooth stone shaped like a teardrop, and a stack of folded parchment tied together with twine. She untied it. The top letter bore no name, no date. The handwriting, though, was unmistakable, her grandmother's. "If you're reading this," it began, "then I suppose the cabin has called you back. I knew it would, one day. It always remembers who needs it." Elia's breath caught. She continued to read. "I used to come here when the world outside felt too loud. When I forgot how to be quiet inside myself. The walls don't speak, but they listen. And sometimes, that's all we really need." Tears pricked the corners of Elia's eyes, but she didn't let them fall. Instead, she smiled. The kind of smile that comes from recognition, from being known even after someone is gone. The letter continued with little stories. Moments. Notes about the garden that once stood beyond the porch. Mentions of a fox that visited at dusk. A recipe for a tea made from fir needles and apple skins. At the bottom, a final line: "When you are ready, add your own letter to the stack. You'll know what to say." She folded the parchment slowly, with reverence, and placed it back in the bundle. Her fingers lingered on it a moment longer. Then she lit the lamp. Not because it was dark, but because it felt right. She drew a blank page from the drawer, uncapped a pen, and placed her hand over the paper. She didn't write right away. She listened. The rain had returned, soft and patient. The kettle began to sing. And Elia smiled again. After breakfast. A bowl of oats, a handful of dried berries, and a drizzle of something sweet Elia found in a small jar labeled solstice honey. She stepped out onto the porch. The rain had faded to mist, and the sky was a silvery blue, the kind that holds its breath between weathers. The cabin's porch creaked familiarly beneath her as she stepped onto it. She wrapped her shawl tighter around her shoulders, pausing to breathe in the earth-heavy air. Something in it felt different today. As though the cabin had more to show. She wandered beyond the porch, following the winding stones hidden beneath damp moss. Ferns brushed her ankles. Low branches swept her shoulders. She let her fingers trail against them, grounding herself. And then, she saw it. Beyond a narrow thicket, the forest opened into a gentle hollow. And there, tucked between trees and shielded by nature's arms, was a garden. Or at least, what had once been one. Wooden beds sat sunken and softened by time. Ivy crept across the low fences, and the sign that read, "Herbs and Wildlings," had nearly faded to blank. Yet despite the years, the shape of it all remained. Quiet. Waiting. She knelt beside the first bed. Lavender. Or what had been lavender, now woody stalks and stubborn roots. She brushed back the leaves and felt the soil beneath. Still rich. Still breathing. With a quiet determination, Elia rolled up her sleeves. She worked through the morning. Pulling weeds gently, uncovering sleeping herbs, rescuing forgotten thyme and sprigs of mint. She didn't rush. Each motion was slow, deliberate. Like an offering. By midday, the mist had lifted, and light slanted softly through the branches above. Birds had returned. A squirrel chattered nearby, unimpressed by her presence. Elia sat on a low stone wall and wiped her hands on her apron. She looked over what she'd cleared. It wasn't much. But it was a beginning. And somehow, that felt sacred. She closed her eyes, letting the sunlight kiss her face. The breeze carried the scent of pine and new earth. Somewhere in the cabin, a wind chime she hadn't noticed before gave a single chime. She would return tomorrow. The garden wasn't just a memory anymore. It was hers now, too. To be continued. It was evening again. The sky had turned a pale lavender, the last light slipping behind the distant pines. Elia stood by the window, holding a warm mug between her hands. The rain had returned, though softer than before, as if remembering the rhythm that soothed her to sleep. She heard it first, a soft rustle just beyond the edge of the garden. Then she saw it. A fox. It stood perfectly still among the mist-draped ferns, as though carved from the silence itself. Its fur was deep auburn, brushed with silver at the tips, and its eyes held a calm intelligence that made Elia forget to breathe for a moment. The fox looked at her. Not in fear. Not in curiosity. Just recognition. Elia stepped onto the porch slowly, setting her mug on the rail. She didn't speak. There was no need. She simply lowered herself to sit on the top step, wrapping the shawl around her knees. The fox blinked once, then turned and began walking along the edge of the garden path. It paused, glancing back. An invitation. Elia hesitated only a second before standing. She followed. They moved through the forest in near silence. The fox stayed just ahead, never rushing, never lagging. The mist thickened as they went deeper, softening the trees, muffling every sound but the rain. Eventually, they reached a clearing she didn't know. It was small, ringed with trees older than any she'd seen. In the center stood a single, smooth stone, shaped like a bench, worn from weather and time. The fox stepped onto the stone, curled its tail around its paws, and stared upward. Elia followed its gaze. Above, the branches parted just enough to reveal a sliver of sky. Through the mist, a few early stars shimmered. And then, silence. Not the kind that is empty. The kind that is full of presence. Elia sat beside the stone. She didn't ask questions. She simply rested her hands on her knees and breathed. The fox didn't move. Neither did she. It was enough. That night, after returning from the woods, Elia lit a small candle and climbed the stairs again. There was a chest she hadn't yet opened, an old one at the end of the attic room. It was low, wide, and banded with iron. A faded velvet ribbon had been tied loosely around its handles. She knelt before it and undid the ribbon. Inside, folded quilts. Dozens of them. Each different. Each hand-stitched. Some made of wool, others of cotton worn thin with love. One in particular caught her eye, a patchwork of forest colors, pine green, bark brown, cloud gray, and sky blue. She lifted it out gently and unfolded it. The scent of cedar and thyme rose up like memory. Elia wrapped it around her shoulders and sat beside the window. The stars were brighter now, and though the rain had stopped, droplets still clung to the glass, glowing like tiny lanterns. She traced the stitches with her fingers. Each piece of fabric was different, a shirt, a dress, a curtain, a story. Someone had sewn it not only to warm, but to remember. On the inside corner, a name was embroidered, May. Elia's grandmother. She held the quilt close. And for the first time since arriving, she whispered into the quiet, "Thank you." Not to anyone in particular, but to the cabin, to the stars, to the past. And the quiet answered in the way only quiet can, by holding her fully. The next morning brought a peculiar stillness. No wind, no birdsong, just the soft hush of a world catching its breath. Elia wandered through the forest again, drawn not by memory this time, but by instinct. She followed the same path the fox had led her along, though now it seemed subtly changed, wider in some places, narrower in others, as if the forest had shifted in her sleep. Eventually, she reached a place she hadn't seen before, a circle of trees unlike any other. They were tall and smooth-barked, pale like birch, but glowing faintly from within. Dozens of small lanterns hung from their branches, unmoving, each one flickering with a light that didn't seem to need flame. Elia stepped into the circle. The moment she did, the air shifted, cooler, clearer, softer. Like walking into a sacred breath. She stood beneath the lanterns and closed her eyes. In the quiet, a memory rose, not hers, but one she felt she'd been entrusted with. A child laughing. A song hummed by a voice long gone. The scent of pine smoke and bread baking. She opened her eyes. One lantern had lowered itself to her height. Gently, carefully, she reached out and touched it. It pulsed warmly. She whispered, "I remember." And all around her, the other lanterns seemed to brighten, just for a moment. As if they believed her. To be continued. That afternoon, Elia stayed indoors. The rain had returned in full, tapping hard against the roof and windows like 1,000 quiet questions. She moved from room to room, lighting a lamp here, straightening a blanket there, not because anything was out of place, but because the motions felt good. Eventually, she paused by the hallway shelf. Narrow, tucked between two support beams. She hadn't noticed it before. On it sat a row of tiny objects, pine cones, a thimble, a pressed leaf, a painted pebble. Beneath each item, a handwritten label. The first snow. Nora's laughter. The button from his coat. Hope, carried. None of them made sense alone. But together, they sang a story in silence. A kind of poetry, too fragile for full sentences. She added a small pebble of her own, still damp from the garden. With her pen, she wrote beneath it, "Returned." On the upper shelf of the bedroom, Elia found a book. It was heavy, leather-bound, and without a title. When she opened it, she discovered no words. Just blank, creamy pages, hundreds of them. But as she turned the pages, she began to see impressions. A fingerprint in faded ink. The shadow of a pressed flower. A faint smudge where someone may have rested their hand. It wasn't meant to be read. It was meant to be felt. She ran her hand slowly down one page, and in her mind, a single line appeared. Some stories don't need to be written. They just need to be remembered. She closed the book and held it to her chest. That night, the wind rose. It wasn't harsh, but purposeful, stroking the cabin's walls and eaves like a musician tuning strings. As Elia added another log to the fire, she heard it, a faint creak beneath the rug. She knelt, lifted the edge. There, a floorboard slightly raised. She pried it up carefully. Inside, a folded note. Yellowed with time. Her heart quickened. It read, "If you're reading this, it means you found the place where things are kept safest. Where thoughts wait to be understood. Please leave one behind." And so she did. She wrote, "I'm not lost. I just stopped moving for a while." She folded the note, placed it beside the first, and returned the board. In the kitchen, on the highest shelf, sat a single teacup. Mismatched. No saucer. Cracked slightly at the rim. And yet, it was the one she chose that morning. She brewed tea slowly. Mint and cinnamon bark. As the water swirled into the pot, she watched the steam rise and remembered hands that had poured for her long ago. She took the cup out to the porch. Sat in the rocking chair. Wrapped herself in the patchwork quilt. The cup warmed her fingers. The sky was gray and full. The cabin didn't ask her to do anything. It just held space for her to sit. And sip. And be. To be continued. That evening, Elia lit the lamp by the window and placed another log on the fire. The wind had quieted, the kind of quiet that felt like listening. She noticed a chair near the corner, one she hadn't used. It faced slightly toward the door, as if waiting for someone to arrive. A small cushion rested on its seat, embroidered with the word, "Stay." She didn't know who the chair was for. But she dusted it gently, fluffed the cushion, and placed a second teacup on the table beside it. Just in case. The attic window had always been her favorite. Round, slightly fogged at the edges, it looked out over the tops of the trees. This morning, Elia found herself drawn to it. She pulled a chair close and watched as fog curled through the branches. The world outside felt distant and close all at once. As she sat, she noticed something, her own reflection. Not quite as it should be. Softer. Smiling. She leaned forward, and the figure in the glass tilted its head just a moment before she did. She blinked. Laughed. And whispered, "I see you." The fog cleared slightly. Outside, a bird landed on the sill, ruffled its feathers, and stayed. Downstairs, above the mantel, hung a clock. It had never worked. The hand stayed frozen at 4:11. No ticking. No chiming. But today, as Elia passed it, she heard something. A breath. She turned, and for a moment, the second hand twitched. Not forward, but back. Then silence again. She smiled, placed her hand gently on the wood, and said, "It's all right. I'm not keeping time either." That night, Elia climbed into bed early. The room was warm, the firelight casting sleepy shadows on the walls. The cat leapt up beside her, curling into the crook of her knees. She pulled the quilt to her chin and let her eyes wander the ceiling. Above her, in the wood beams, were tiny carvings she hadn't seen before: stars, moons, small initials, leaves. She traced one with her finger. It felt like a story pressed into the walls. A whisper left behind. She whispered one of her own, "Safe." And the beams held it gently, like all the others. To be continued. The day stretched slow and golden, like honey spilled across old wood. Elia rose with the hush of morning still clinging to her, moved through the cabin with quiet intention. She made tea with rosemary and orange peel, then sat at the low table where the lamp waited. There, she found the journal again. Not the blank one. The green one. The one that whispered without speaking. She untied the ribbon and opened it, not to any page in particular. The entries were not in order, and they didn't need to be. Each one was a doorway. A breath. She flipped until she found a short line: "What we return to is not always the same. But it is always still waiting." Elia nodded. She reached for her pen. And she wrote. She wrote about the mist. About the cat's warm weight across her legs. About the fox. About the smell of dust and violet in the attic. About the silence between raindrops that sounded like someone humming far off in the trees. Pages turned. The light changed. The tea cooled. She paused only once, to add a pressed clover she found outside the door that morning. Tucked it gently between two pages. It would live there now, like all the other moments. This wasn't a story that needed to end. But it needed to be marked. At the bottom of the final page, she wrote, "I remembered myself here." That was enough. She closed the journal. Not to seal it, but to let it breathe. That evening, as twilight folded into dusk, Elia returned to the circle of lantern trees. They flickered gently in the windless air, as if breathing with her. She stood in the center and waited, not knowing for what, but certain she was not alone. The lanterns brightened. The ground shifted. A new path appeared, stones lit from below, small and warm under her feet. She followed. The path led deep into the forest, beyond the maps, beyond where names mattered. Trees grew stranger here. Twisting like thoughts, leaning like listeners. The further she walked, the more the forest felt like dream. And at the end, a door. Just a door. Standing alone among moss and stone. Wooden. Worn. Painted with a single symbol, a spiral of light. She didn't knock. She simply placed her hand against it. It opened inward. Inside was herself. Or a version of her. Sitting by a fire. Smiling. Reading. The room looked like the cabin, and yet not. A variation. A memory. A possibility. The other Elia looked up. Nodded. And disappeared. The fire remained. Elia stepped in, sat, and waited. For what, she didn't know. Only that she belonged here too. To be concluded, the fire burned low in the strange yet familiar room beyond the lantern path. Elia sat in the same chair she had seen in her vision, wrapped in the silence like a cloak. No cat, no cup, no storm. Only herself, and that was more than enough. She didn't know how long she sat there. Time, in this place, did not behave. When she finally rose, the fire dimmed behind her, glowing steady but letting go. She walked to the door and opened it, not to a forest, but to a hallway. One she recognized. The cabin's hallway. Had she imagined it all? Had she wandered in a dream? It didn't matter. Everything she'd felt lived in her still. Back in the main room, the kettle had begun to hum. The lamp was still lit. The blanket folded neatly. Nothing had changed, and yet, everything had. She opened the door to the outside. Morning mist clung to the ground. Birds chirped faintly in the distance. A new kind of quiet filled the forest, not from absence, but from deep presence. She stepped out barefoot onto the stones. The cold didn't bite. It simply was. The forest did not greet her, it acknowledged her. She walked through the garden. Touched a sprig of thyme. Smiled at a mushroom growing where the rain had soaked deepest. And then she knelt. In the soft earth, she pressed her palm, leaving an impression. No words. No symbols. Just touch. She whispered, "Thank you." To the trees. To the cabin. To herself. And stood. Back inside, she poured tea. The same mismatched cup. She carried it to the armchair. The cat returned from somewhere, leapt into her lap, curled in without a sound. Elia didn't read. Didn't write. Didn't think. She simply sat. And the cabin remembered her. The rain had returned. Not as a storm, nor even a gentle tapping, but as a steady hush. The kind of rain that didn't interrupt but accompanied. It wrapped the forest like a shawl and softened the edges of every sound, every movement, every breath. Elia stood at the window with a mug in her hand, though the tea inside had long since gone cold. She wasn't looking for anything beyond the glass. Just watching. Just being. Outside, the world shimmered in silver. Leaves twitched under the weight of water, and the moss that lined the old stone path pulsed green with gratitude. The forest was alive in its own stillness. Inside, the cabin welcomed her silence. The fire cracked softly in the hearth. The lamp on the corner table spilled gold across the pages of the open book she hadn't touched. And the cat, now a steady companion, curled into a ball in the corner of the armchair, purring faintly, like it too was remembering something it didn't need to explain. Elia let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. She turned from the window and moved slowly through the room, her fingertips trailing the edge of the bookshelf, the back of the old chair, the worn corner of the writing desk. Every surface seemed to hum with quiet memory. Tonight, there was no plan. No ritual. No need to mark time. She simply let the evening unfold. She lit candles, one by the stove, one on the mantel, one by the stairs. Not because it was dark, but because it felt right. She made soup from what she found in the cupboard, lentils, dried thyme, a pinch of peppercorn. She stirred slowly, tasting, adjusting, tasting again. There was no recipe, only rhythm. As the pot simmered, she opened the chest in the corner of the room, the one she had not yet touched. Inside, she found letters. Not loose, but bundled. Dozens of bundles. Each tied with twine or ribbon or thread. Some thick with age, others brittle, nearly dust. One was labeled unsent. Another, rainy days. One simply read, to be opened by a fire. She chose that one. She untied the ribbon, sky blue, frayed at the ends, and picked up the top letter. The ink was soft brown, the handwriting elegant, but uncertain in places. To the one who finds comfort in the quiet, I don't know your name. I don't need to. If you are here, it means you heard the invitation. Not with your ears, but with something older. Something softer. The cabin does not call just anyone. It waits. And when you are ready, truly ready, it lets you in. Elia folded the letter. Not to hide it, but to hold it better. She read the next. And the next. Some were long. Some were only a few words. Tonight I forgave myself. I left the door open for someone who never returned. I think that was the point. I watched the rain until I forgot what I came here to forget. Thank you. Each letter was a lantern. A moment suspended. A whisper of someone who once sat where she now sat, held the same cup, lit the same fire. When the soup was ready, she filled a bowl and sat on the floor near the hearth. The cat stretched, blinked once, and joined her, tail flicking against her knee. Outside, the rain continued. Inside, time stretched. And softened. And folded. The evening went on. And so did she. Hours passed, though Elia would not have known if not for the fire, which had dimmed to a red hush, or the clock on the wall that did not keep time but sometimes gave it back. The cabin had grown quieter, as though it too were breathing more deeply, settling into the soft folds of night. Outside, the rain had stilled. Not ended, only paused, like a page between paragraphs. Elia rose slowly, placing her empty bowl in the sink and covering the pot with a clean cloth. She didn't wash up. Not yet. There was no urgency here, no consequence for waiting. She moved to the old cupboard beside the stairs. The one with the carved acorn handles and a narrow keyhole that had never asked for a key. When she opened it, she found a blanket folded beside a box of postcards, every one blank, save for a few with single-line messages on the back, still here. No words, just light. If you remember me, I wasn't lost. Beneath the box lay a collection of photographs, black and white and warm at the edges, as though printed on memory itself. Some showed the cabin, not as it was now, but close. Others showed people she did not know, all sitting in the same chair by the fire, holding the same cup, wearing the same look of unburdened breath. She smiled at one. A young boy with a mop of curls, asleep beneath the writing desk, a book open on his chest and a cat nearly identical to hers perched protectively on his legs. She placed the photos back gently. Upstairs, the attic glowed faintly. She climbed the stairs barefoot, the wood warm under her soles. The green journal still rested where she'd left it, closed now, as if it too had rested. But tonight, it wasn't the journal that called to her. It was the small drawer beneath the attic window. Inside, tucked into the shadows, she found a tiny bottle with a cork stopper. Inside, a rolled scrap of parchment, and beside it, a note, "Write something you've never told the wind." Elia uncorked the bottle. Unrolled the parchment. She didn't hesitate. She wrote, "I once wished to be forgotten, just so I could be surprised when I was remembered. She rolled the paper and returned it to the bottle. Then, carefully, she opened the window. The night air was crisp but kind. She held the bottle in her palm, whispered to it once, something only the dark would hear, and let it fall gently into the moss below. Tomorrow, it would be gone. Or found. Or both. She sat at the window for a long while after, watching the sky stitch stars into place. Not for answers. Not for signs. But simply because the night had invited her. And she said yes. The next morning arrived slowly. The light did not rush in through the windows, nor did the forest stir with sudden birdsong. Instead, the world seemed to breathe itself back into place, one shimmer of dew at a time. Elia woke wrapped in warmth, not just from the quilt and the cat curled like a calma at her feet, but from the kind of quiet that only comes after being truly heard. She did not speak as she rose, nor stretch. She simply slid from bed and into the morning like a note returning to melody. Downstairs, the kettle had already begun its low hum. She did not question how. The cabin, she had come to realize, anticipated. With tea in hand, she moved through the cabin, not out of habit, but from instinct. Her steps took her to corners she had not yet explored, narrow closets tucked beneath sloped ceilings, drawers lined with velvet, hooks where dried flowers still hung from seasons past. Behind a curtain near the back of the kitchen, she found a door. Not hidden, not locked. Just quiet. It opened onto a hallway she hadn't known was there. The air here was cooler. Not cold, but still. Expectant. The hallway was lined with objects, each on its own small table, shelf, or pedestal. Each lit by a narrow shaft of light from above, though no lamps or windows could be seen. The first was a pair of glasses. Round, with gold rims slightly bent at the nose. Beside them, a scrap of paper. He only needed them to read stories aloud. Next, a ring of keys, none alike. All worn smooth. She locked away the memory, but not the love. A pipe carved from cherry wood. He never smoked it. It belonged to his grandfather. That was enough. Elia moved from one to the next. A child's boot. A spoon with initials. A feather too large for any bird she knew. Each came with a line. A story in 10 words or less. Each object belonged to someone, perhaps to no one now. Or perhaps, to the house itself. At the end of the hallway, she found a large wardrobe. Carved vines wrapped its edges. At the center, 2 crescent moons faced each other, not quite touching. Inside. A coat. A notebook. A pencil. A small satchel. And a note: if you ever decide to leave, take only what reminds you to return. She smiled softly, and closed the doors. On her way back, she passed the objects again. But this time, she left something of her own. On the empty shelf beneath the feather, she placed a folded page torn from the green journal. On it, she had written, "I did not know what I carried until I set it down." The hallway did not reply. But the light above the page grew warmer. Later, by the fire, Elia sat with the cat now sprawled across her legs like a soft, purring anchor. The cabin had grown no smaller, but she had grown more present. And in that presence, everything had expanded. She sipped her tea. Read from a book she found near the rocking chair, stories of mountains that listened and lakes that whispered dreams. When night fell again, she did not light every lamp. Only one. Just enough. And the cabin exhaled with her. The house of quiet things had remembered her, too. The morning after the hallway of quiet things, Elia awoke with a question, not the kind that demanded an answer, but one that asked to be carried. She dressed slowly, savoring the soft weight of the air, and followed the scent of pine and cooled ash to the front porch. The world outside was dripping. Rain had come in the night and left everything glistening, branches like chandeliers, stones like ink. The trees stood tall, as if they'd slept well. Elia sat on the porch steps, still in her socks. The wood was damp but not cold. The cat curled beside her without fanfare, a familiar punctuation mark in the sentence of her morning. She noticed it then. Near the edge of the path, barely visible beneath a fern, something pale, folded. Elia stood and walked to it slowly, as though not to wake it. It was a paper bird. Folded with careful hands, creased with purpose. It had no writing, no signature, no ribbon to mark its origin. But the moment Elia held it in her palms, she knew, this had been waiting. She carried it inside. Placed it on the low table. Lit the kettle. The bird remained where it was, quiet as a secret. When the tea was ready, she poured it into her green-speckled mug, the one that had been there from her first night, and returned to the bird. A breeze, sudden and small, stirred the curtains. And the bird moved. Not flew, not quite. But unfolded. Not like paper should. Its wings gently parted, and there on its chest, a message appeared. Not written, but revealed, as though ink had been waiting under breath and time. It read, "You are part of the story now. Write like you never left." Elia felt no surprise. Only a calm blooming. She took the bird, now flat, and placed it in the green journal, pressing it between pages like a wildflower. She did not need to ask where it came from. The cabin had always spoken in strange ways. She spent the rest of the day in a gentle rhythm. She baked a simple bread from flour and honey she found in tall glass jars. She gathered moss from beside the stones and layered it in a small bowl by the sink. She opened the window above the desk and let the breeze stir the pages of every book she'd ever thought to finish. And then, as the light turned amber, she wrote. Not for the journal. Not for the wind. But for herself. She wrote about the paper bird. About the room that held echoes. About a moment she remembered from childhood, lying beneath a heavy quilt, her grandmother's voice whispering a story where nothing happened and everything healed. She let her pen slow. And when she looked up, the bird was gone. In its place, a folded corner of one page had turned. And there, in her own handwriting, though she had no memory of writing it, a sentence waited. We are never lost in the woods we choose to walk. Elia smiled. That night, the rain returned. Not hard, not soft. Just, true. And the cabin, like always, remembered how to listen. There was a door Elia had passed a dozen times, beside the lampstand in the narrow hall between the kitchen and the small music alcove. It was ordinary, painted the same shade of muted green as the walls, with a round wooden knob worn smooth. But tonight, it was open. Not wide, just enough to catch the edge of her attention as she passed with a folded blanket in her arms. She stopped. The room beyond was dim, but not unwelcoming. No lamps, but soft light from somewhere. A glow that didn't seem to come from flame or filament. Elia stepped inside. It was small. And entirely unfamiliar. Unlike the rest of the cabin, which felt lived in, remembered, touched, this space felt paused. Like a breath held mid-sentence. There was a low bench under the window, a writing desk without a chair, and shelves, empty. But only at first. As she stepped further in, the shelves changed. On one appeared a cup. Then a frame with no picture. Then a wooden puzzle piece the size of her palm. And she knew, somehow, these were not decorative. They were hers. Not from now, but from before. A stone she once pocketed as a child and lost in a stream. A ticket stub to a concert she never attended. A page torn from a journal she never filled. This was not a room of memories. It was a room of almosts. She sat on the bench and felt the hush fold in around her. The window looked out on nothing she recognized. Not the forest, not the path, but a soft gray mist, swirling as though remembering the shape of stories before they were told. One by one, more objects appeared. A pair of boots too small to wear now, with mud still dry on the soles. A letter she had once written but never sent. A strand of red thread she once tied to her wrist in a moment of promise she had since forgotten. This room did not judge. It held. Elia stood and walked slowly to the desk. There was a drawer now. She opened it. Inside, a single blank page. And a key. She took both. No door had ever asked for a key in the cabin. But perhaps this one would. Someday. She folded the page and slipped it into her coat. Then held the key up to the soft light. It shimmered. Warm. Weightless. She placed it in her palm and closed her fingers gently. As she turned to leave, the room dimmed once more, not disappearing, but resting. And the door, without her touch, closed behind her with a sound like the final line of a poem. That night, Elia did not write. She did not read. She simply lay under the quilt with the folded page beside her, the cat curled against her spine, and the knowledge that not all rooms need answers. Some only need to wait. The next morning arrived slowly. A breeze like a sigh slipped through the cracks in the old window frames, and the scent of pine needles steeped in last night's rain settled softly into the floorboards. The cat had already disappeared somewhere between the cupboards and the curtains, as it often did when dawn was still deciding what to do with itself. Elia stirred. Her hand brushed the page she had taken from the desk drawer in the quiet room, the blank one, the one folded once and placed neatly in her coat pocket the night before. But it was no longer blank. She sat upright. The page, still folded in that precise, deliberate way, now carried ink. A letter, written in her own handwriting. Unmistakable, but in words she did not remember writing. She read, "Dear you, I know you were scared to come here. You didn't even realize how much until the quiet wrapped around you like a coat too familiar to resist. But here you are. And I see you. I remember you. You once loved thunder because it made your pulse match the sky. You once buried poems in jars in the backyard and hoped someone would find them. You once tried to walk away from everything and still came back to the sound of kettle whistles and soft chairs. You didn't fail. You paused. And now, you're listening again. That's enough." Elia's hands trembled slightly. Not in fear, but in recognition. The page said more. "There's something you've forgotten, not because you lost it, but because it stayed still while you ran ahead. It's in the box under the floorboard in the back room. You should open it now. I promise. It won't hurt the way you think it will. Love, you. The letter ended with a small symbol in the corner, a tiny circle with a line through it. The same symbol that marked the secret door behind the quilt weeks ago. Elia stood, folding the page again, this time slowly, reverently, and slipped on her boots. The back room had always felt quiet. Dim, but warm. It was where she often paused in the afternoons with her tea, where the sun settled in patches along the old rug like lazy cats. She had never checked beneath the floor. But the floor told her now. One loose board. She found it without thinking. Lifted it. Inside, a box. Not ornate. Not ancient. Just wood, soft at the edges, smoothed by time and fingers and waiting. She lifted the lid. Inside, a photograph. Herself, as a child, holding a daisy in one hand and a piece of chalk in the other, standing beside a tree with initials carved faintly into the bark. A pressed flower, too delicate to name. A list, written in uneven script, things I want to remember, how it smells before it rains, the laugh that came from my belly, how I once believed every stone could talk, that I used to be brave without even trying, a second letter. This one, not in her hand. Older. Maybe her grandmother's. Elia, I knew you'd come here one day. This place is stitched with our stories. Some you've heard. Some you haven't yet remembered. You were always meant to find it again. This cabin isn't just a place. It's a conversation between past and present, silence and sound, breath and memory. Take what you need. Leave what you no longer carry. And when it's time, open the last drawer. With all the love I never got to say aloud, Elia pressed the page to her chest. Closed her eyes. There was no ache. No pang. Just a soft fullness. Like fog lifting off the lake when the sun finally rises. She placed the photograph on the windowsill. She left the box open. And she smiled. Then she rose. There was still so much story left to feel. Elia didn't open the drawer right away. The one her grandmother had written about. Instead, she let the hours move through her like weather. The way early sun poured into the cabin made her think of lullabies that never had words. She found herself rinsing fruit slowly in the sink, the sound of water over apples a rhythm she didn't want to end. The cat returned, brushed against her ankle, and vanished again into one of its many soft corners of the house. Elia smiled after it. Then she reached for the green journal and opened it at random, hoping the pages would know where to land. They always did. There, in her own scribbled ink, written days ago, maybe longer, was a single sentence. Some things open you before they open themselves. So when the moment came, she was ready. The drawer was in the old writing desk upstairs. The one in the attic beneath the round window that watched the stars. She had never paid it much attention, not beyond using it as a place to rest her teacup or stack half-read books. But the drawer had always been there. Waiting. It stuck slightly as she pulled it. Not resistance, exactly, more like memory holding on. Inside, a stack of folded papers tied with pale green thread. And beneath them, a small stone. Elia touched the stone first. It was smooth and warm. Carved into its surface was the same circle and line symbol, the one from the hidden door, from the letter, from everything. The symbol that had followed her since she arrived, quiet and ever-present. She held it in her palm. And the attic changed. Not in walls or furniture, but in weight. The air grew thick with hush. The light through the window bent slightly. And something in her chest unfolded. She untied the thread. The pages were journal entries. Not hers, but familiar. They were written by her grandmother, but also by others. Different hands. Different years. Every page began with a single prompt. What do you carry that was never yours to hold? The answers were, honest. Unvarnished. Raw. I carry silence from rooms I should have spoken in. I carry a fear passed from mother to daughter to daughter. I carry the feeling of being too much and not enough. I carry dreams that were never mine, worn like heirlooms. Each entry was followed by a simple final sentence. I leave it here. Elia read until the light shifted. And then she understood. She picked up her own pen. Opened to the final blank page of her journal. And wrote, I carry the echo of always being the one who stayed quiet so others could speak. I carry the guilt of growing when others chose to shrink. I carry the belief that peace must be earned, not allowed. I carry the need to prove I am not a burden. I carry the fear that if I rest too long, I will vanish. She paused. And then, I leave it here. She folded the page. Placed it with the others. Closed the drawer. Outside, the wind stirred softly. Elia returned to the main room, her movements quiet, steady. The fire was still burning. The cat was now asleep on her pillow, having claimed it, as usual, without permission. She curled into the chair by the fire. Pulled the wool blanket over her knees. And in the hush of the golden hour, she realized, some drawers do not hide things. They hold space for release. And some stories aren't told to be remembered. They're told so we can finally forget. There was a door Elia had passed a dozen times, beside the lampstand in the narrow hall between the kitchen and the small music alcove. It was ordinary, painted the same shade of muted green as the walls, with a round wooden knob worn smooth. But tonight, it was open. Not wide, just enough to catch the edge of her attention as she passed with a folded blanket in her arms. She stopped. The room beyond was dim, but not unwelcoming. No lamps, but soft light from somewhere. A glow that didn't seem to come from flame or filament. Elia stepped inside. It was small. And entirely unfamiliar. Unlike the rest of the cabin, which felt lived in, remembered, touched, this space felt, paused. Like a breath held mid-sentence. There was a low bench under the window, a writing desk without a chair, and shelves, empty. But only at first. As she stepped further in, the shelves changed. On one appeared a cup. Then a frame with no picture. Then a wooden puzzle piece the size of her palm. And she knew, somehow, these were not decorative. They were hers. Not from now, but from before. A stone she once pocketed as a child and lost in a stream. A ticket stub to a concert she never attended. A page torn from a journal she never filled. This was not a room of memories. It was a room of almosts. She sat on the bench and felt the hush fold in around her. The window looked out on nothing she recognized. Not the forest, not the path, but a soft gray mist, swirling as though remembering the shape of stories before they were told. One by one, more objects appeared. A pair of boots too small to wear now, with mud still dry on the soles. A letter she had once written but never sent. A strand of red thread she once tied to her wrist in a moment of promise she had since forgotten. This room did not judge. It held. Elia stood and walked slowly to the desk. There was a drawer now. She opened it. Inside, a single blank page. And a key. She took both. No door had ever asked for a key in the cabin. But perhaps this one would. Someday. She folded the page and slipped it into her coat. Then held the key up to the soft light. It shimmered. Warm. Weightless. She placed it in her palm and closed her fingers gently. As she turned to leave, the room dimmed once more, not disappearing, but resting. And the door, without her touch, closed behind her with a sound like the final line of a poem. That night, Elia did not write. She did not read. She simply lay under the quilt with the folded page beside her, the cat curled against her spine, and the knowledge that not all rooms need answers. Some only need to wait. The next morning arrived slowly. A breeze like a sigh slipped through the cracks in the old window frames, and the scent of pine needles steeped in last night's rain settled softly into the floorboards. The cat had already disappeared somewhere between the cupboards and the curtains, as it often did when Dawn was still deciding what to do with itself. Elia stirred. Her hand brushed the page she had taken from the desk drawer in the quiet room, the blank one, the one folded once and placed neatly in her coat pocket the night before. But it was no longer blank. She sat upright. The page, still folded in that precise, deliberate way, now carried ink. A letter, written in her own handwriting. Unmistakable, but in words she did not remember writing. She read, "Dear you, I know you were scared to come here. You didn't even realize how much until the quiet wrapped around you like a coat too familiar to resist. But here you are. And I see you. I remember you. You once loved thunder because it made your pulse match the sky. You once buried poems in jars in the backyard and hoped someone would find them. You once tried to walk away from everything and still came back to the sound of kettle whistles and soft chairs. You didn't fail. You paused. And now, you're listening again. That's enough." Elia's hands trembled slightly. Not in fear, but in recognition. The page said more. "There's something you've forgotten, not because you lost it, but because it stayed still while you ran ahead. It's in the box under the floorboard in the back room. You should open it now. I promise. It won't hurt the way you think it will. Love, you." The letter ended with a small symbol in the corner, a tiny circle with a line through it. The same symbol that marked the secret door behind the quilt weeks ago. Elia stood, folding the page again, this time slowly, reverently, and slipped on her boots. The back room had always felt quiet. Dim, but warm. It was where she often paused in the afternoons with her tea, where the sun settled in patches along the old rug like lazy cats. She had never checked beneath the floor. But the floor told her now. One loose board. She found it without thinking. Lifted it. Inside, a box. Not ornate. Not ancient. Just wood, soft at the edges, smoothed by time and fingers and waiting. She lifted the lid. Inside, a photograph. Herself, As a child, holding a daisy in one hand and a piece of chalk in the other, standing beside a tree with initials carved faintly into the bark. A pressed flower, too delicate to name. A list, written in uneven script, things I want to remember, how it smells before it rains, the laugh that came from my belly, how I once believed every stone could talk, that I used to be brave without even trying, a second letter. This one, not in her hand. Older. Maybe her grandmother's. Elia, I knew you'd come here one day. This place is stitched with our stories. Some you've heard. Some you haven't yet remembered. You were always meant to find it again. This cabin isn't just a place. It's a conversation between past and present, silence and sound, breath and memory. Take what you need. Leave what you no longer carry. And when it's time, open the last drawer. With all the love I never got to say aloud, Elia pressed the page to her chest. Closed her eyes. There was no ache. No pang. Just a soft fullness. Like fog lifting off the lake when the sun finally rises. She placed the photograph on the windowsill. She left the box open. And she smiled. Then she rose. There was still so much story left to feel. Elia didn't open the drawer right away. The one her grandmother had written about. Instead, she let the hours move through her like weather. The way early sun poured into the cabin made her think of lullabies that never had words. She found herself rinsing fruit slowly in the sink, the sound of water over apples a rhythm she didn't want to end. The cat returned, brushed against her ankle, and vanished again into one of its many soft corners of the house. Elia smiled after it. Then she reached for the green journal and opened it at random, hoping the pages would know where to land. They always did. There, in her own scribbled ink, written days ago, maybe longer, was a single sentence: some things open you before they open themselves. So when the moment came, she was ready. The drawer was in the old writing desk upstairs. The one in the attic beneath the round window that watched the stars. She had never paid it much attention, not beyond using it as a place to rest her teacup or stack half-read books. But the drawer had always been there. Waiting. It stuck slightly as she pulled it. Not resistance, exactly, more like memory holding on. Inside, a stack of folded papers tied with pale green thread. And beneath them, a small stone. Elia touched the stone first. It was smooth and warm. Carved into its surface was the same circle and line symbol, the one from the hidden door, from the letter, from everything. The symbol that had followed her since she arrived, quiet and ever-present. She held it in her palm. And the attic changed. Not in walls or furniture, but in weight. The air grew thick with hush. The light through the window bent slightly. And something in her chest unfolded. She untied the thread. The pages were journal entries. Not hers, but familiar. They were written by her grandmother, but also by others. Different hands. Different years. Every page began with a single prompt. What do you carry that was never yours to hold? The answers were, honest. Unvarnished. Raw. I carry silence from rooms I should have spoken in. I carry a fear passed from mother to daughter to daughter. I carry the feeling of being too much and not enough. I carry dreams that were never mine, worn like heirlooms. Each entry was followed by a simple final sentence: I leave it here. Elia read until the light shifted. And then she understood. She picked up her own pen, opened to the final blank page of her journal, and wrote, "I carry the echo of always being the one who stayed quiet so others could speak. I carry the guilt of growing when others chose to shrink. I carry the belief that peace must be earned, not allowed. I carry the need to prove I am not a burden. I carry the fear that if I rest too long, I will vanish." She paused. "And then, I leave it here." She folded the page, placed it with the others, closed the drawer. Outside, the wind stirred softly. Elia returned to the main room, her movements quiet, steady. The fire was still burning. The cat was now asleep on her pillow, having claimed it, as usual, without permission. She curled into the chair by the fire, pulled the wool blanket over her knees. And in the hush of the golden hour, she realized, some drawers do not hide things. They hold space for release. And some stories aren't told to be remembered. They're told so we can finally forget. It rained through the night. Not a heavy storm, just a steady conversation between roof and sky, a long exhale through branches and time. When Elia opened her eyes, the world outside the window looked like it had been sketched in charcoal and then gently blurred. She sat up slowly. The fire had gone out, but the warmth still lingered in the thick-woven blanket and the space where the cat had slept beside her. There was no need to move quickly. And yet, she felt drawn, not outward, but inward. She followed the pull through the cabin, letting her feet guide her, not thought. They led her to a narrow alcove just beside the stairs, a space she had always assumed was just a shadowed corner. But today, there was something there. A wooden box. Plain. Closed with a ribbon instead of a latch. On top, a folded note, to the one who never needed directions, but came looking anyway. She opened it. Inside, a map. Or something that resembled a map, drawn on aged paper, faded at the folds. But it was no place she recognized. There were no names, no compass rose, no scale. Just shapes that resembled rivers, clusters of trees, soft hills. Some parts faded into nothing. But here and there, words. Not labels. Feelings. Stillness, where I stopped running, the bench I didn't sit on, warm bread, cold hands. It was a map of emotion. Of memory. Of things felt, not found. At the bottom corner, written faintly, "This map cannot guide you. It can only remind you where you've already been." Elia touched the paper gently. The ink didn't smudge, but something in her chest shifted. She returned to the armchair, unfolded the map across the low table, and studied it the way one studies the night sky, not to navigate, but to wonder. And slowly, she began to draw. Not new paths. Not corrections. Just additions. She drew the window where she had first seen the lanterns. She marked the spot in the forest where the fox had stopped and looked at her. She sketched the curl of steam from her favorite mug. And beside each, she wrote what she had felt, not what she had done. Safe. Seen. Home. The rain outside slowed to a mist. The fire had been relit. She hadn't moved to do it. Maybe the house had. Maybe it always had. Elia folded the map again, carefully, and placed it into the journal between two pages filled with her grandmother's handwriting. Then she stood. And for the first time since arriving, she opened the front door wide. Not to leave. just to breathe. The scent of wet earth rose to meet her. The trees glistened like memory. And far off, beyond the path, something flickered. Not fire. Not lightning. Just a light. Waiting. The flicker did not call to her. It simply remained. A silent, steady presence beyond the bend of trees, like a forgotten thought at the edge of awareness. Elia stood in the doorway longer than she meant to, watching the soft glow pulse faintly between branches. She did not rush. She packed a small satchel, just a thermos of tea, the carved stone with the circle and line, her green journal, and a wool scarf that still carried the scent of lavender from a drawer she hadn't opened in weeks. The cabin didn't try to stop her. It merely watched. Outside, the earth was soft underfoot, each step a gentle hush. She followed the narrow trail that curved behind the cabin, past the moss-covered bench, past the wind-chimed tree whose notes lingered in her chest long after she passed it. The further she walked, the more the trees seemed to bend inward. Not menacing, more like listening. And then she saw it. A lantern. Hanging from a low branch at the edge of a glade. But unlike the others, soft golden and flickering, this one glowed silver blue. Not cold, but clear. A color that felt like moonlight woven with breath. Beneath it, a chair. Simple. Wooden. Waiting. Elia approached slowly. She set her satchel down and sat. The lantern swung gently above her, moved by a wind that had no weight. In front of her, nothing but quiet. And then, across the glade, a second lantern flickered to life. Then another. And another. Dozens, maybe hundreds, illuminating one by one like stars learning how to shine. Not in a path. Not in a pattern. But in a constellation only the forest knew how to read. Elia sat still. And they came. Not people. Not ghosts. But presences. She felt them more than saw them, seated in the other chairs that were now slowly forming around the glade. Chairs that hadn't been there moments before. Rocking chairs. Stools. Cushions on stumps. As if the forest had remembered everyone who'd once needed to be still. No one spoke. And yet, everything was said. One of the lanterns drifted downward. Hovered beside her. Elia reached out. Placed her hand beneath it. It pulsed once, and a single sheet of parchment unfurled from beneath its base. She caught it. On it, do you remember who you were before the world asked you to be someone else? Tears came quietly. Not sadness. Not even grief. Just truth. She folded the parchment. Placed it in her journal. The lantern slowly dimmed, as if sighing in completion. The chairs dissolved like mist in sunlight. And Elia remained, alone but not lonely, in the middle of a glade that now smelled faintly of cedar and first snowfall. She stood. And the path, not one she'd walked in on, but one that had grown around her, opened gently through the trees. The cabin waited at the end of it. Warm. Light in the windows. She stepped inside. Placed the journal on the table. Hung the scarf. Poured tea into her favorite mug. And whispered into the quiet, I remember. That night, Elia didn't sleep immediately. She sat by the hearth, her feet tucked beneath her on the armchair, a blanket around her shoulders like a memory returned. The fire was steady, not lively, but patient. like it had been burning for years and had learned how not to rush. The journal lay open on her lap. She didn't write. Instead, she listened to the sounds of the room. The quiet hum of the cabin's breath, creaks in the beams, the sigh of the wind, the faint tap of condensation dripping from the corners of the windows. Then, in the quietest moment, a chime. Faint. Far. Not from any place she could name. Not wind. Not bell. A note that hung in the air just long enough to shimmer. She stood. The fire didn't protest. The cat didn't stir. Outside, the trees were still. The clouds had cleared, and the moon, full and pale gold, hovered just above the horizon like it, too, had forgotten something it came to remember. And the sound came again. A single tone, carried not on the air, but in it. Like a whisper left in a bell jar. Elia followed it. Barefoot, shawl wrapped tight, she walked deeper into the woods. This time, the path was entirely new, not a path at all, just a space between trees that made room for her passage. And the moon moved with her. It was above, yes, but also ahead. Like it waited for her. The sound grew clearer. Not louder, just more itself. And then, she reached the clearing. Unlike the glade of the lanterns, this space was quiet in a different way. Timeless. Even the trees seemed to have stepped back, bowing slightly. In the center, a pool of still water. Shallow. Reflective. Perfect. Above it, the moon. Below it, its twin. And on the surface of the pool, a ripple. Just one. No wind had made it. No creature had stirred it. It pulsed once. And then the sound came again. Clear. Resonant. Not just a note. A voice. Hers. Soft. Kind. Singing a melody she had never learned but had always known. The pool shimmered. The trees leaned in. And the memory rose. She was small, no more than 6. Sitting on a windowsill in a different house, far from this one, with rain tapping glass like polite fingers. Humming to herself, making up the words, because no one else would hear. Except now, she heard. The moon had carried the sound for decades. Kept it safe. Echoed it back when she was ready. She knelt by the water. Touched it. The surface rippled with light. And as it stilled, the reflection shifted. Not a mirror. A doorway. A memory wrapped in silver. She saw herself, not as a child, not as now, but as possibility. A version of Elia she had forgotten to dream of. Eyes bright, hands open, a presence that welcomed everything without holding too tight. The vision smiled. And Elia whispered, "I remember you." The moon answered with a hum. And the forest exhaled. Elia stood. The pool quieted. The reflection faded. But something stayed with her. Not just a memory. A knowing. She returned to the cabin slowly, carrying silence like a cup of water she didn't want to spill. Inside, the fire still burned. The cat blinked once from the corner and resumed its nap. Elia wrote, "Tonight, the moon sang my voice back to me. And I sang along." She closed the journal. Blew out the lamp. And slept. Not because she was tired, but because she was whole.